Hello again, topic number 2 for this evening's rant series. I'm going to quickly define Zionism. What is it? Where does it come from? What are the various forms of it? Difficult to do in a very short amount of time, but we'll take a shot at it. First off, I want to start with 3 main versions of Zionism: traditional Zionism, classic or secular Zionism, and then religious Zionism. So, first off, traditional Zionism. Traditional Zionism is the belief that Jews will eventually be able to go home, back up to Zion. So, returning to an ancestral homeland. Generally, this is connected to a kind of traditional religiosity. The Messiah, Hamashiach, will come back, and this will signify that God has forgiven his people. With redemption secured, they will return home. They will rebuild the temple and restore sacrifice and all the different elements of the Torah that can no longer be followed, since about 2/3 of Torah cannot be observed without a temple monarchy in the land of Israel. So that's kind of what it's about. It's this yearning to return home. You see it in, Passover Seders next year in Jerusalem, that sort of thing. There's this built-in yearning to go home. But it's not a nationalist movement, it's a religious yearning. And to some degree a cultural one. I suppose you could conceive of technically a kind of secular traditional Zionism that's just tied to a historical association with that biblical narrative and that history. But the Zionism, just basic, generic Zionism, is a secular form of nationalism, which means it's tied to our previous topic. It has its origins in 19th century Europe, in the rise of secular nationalisms that are spreading slowly across Europe during the whole Enlightenment and early 19th century. The earliest nationalist movement you can kind of put in revolutionary France, along with a bunch of other ideas, just slowly drifts further eastward and takes in more and more people. And you start to see Jews beginning to recover a sense of secular nationhood that they've never really had. And they recover the Hebrew language, which had not been a spoken language in, like 2,500 years. It had only been held on as a liturgical language. They flesh it out, take in a lot of vocabulary and grammar influences, and make a functional modern language, start producing new literature, and then they create tons of clubs, the Chovevit Zion, the Lovers of Zion clubs, where people start teaching each other how to farm. Since in much of Europe, because of anti-Judaism and then anti-Semitism, Jews couldn't actually own land or farm. And this is a long-term process. The first really important Zionist work, like a book, it comes out in 1862. And then you have all these Chovevit Zion clubs springing up all over the 1870s. And I think it's in, 1880, 82, something like that. Leo Pinsker's auto-emancipation, or self-emancipation, this idea of Jews redeeming themselves through becoming good proletarians and working the land and changing things. And you end up with the first wave of migration between 1882 and 1903. These are people that are just saving up money, working within these different clubs, and moving to Palestine. This introduces a basic distinction I have to throw at you here, because within that generic that generic Zionism, I hate when I stutter in these videos, you have, Zionism being a program of secular Jewish nationalism focused on the creation of a state in Palestine. There's different ways to do it. First off, practical Zionism is picking up and moving there, just going. Political Zionism is supporting the idea of Jewish redemption, helping it out, raising money, lobbying governments, all that kind of crap. And that's what this fella, Theodor Herzl, is best known for. Again, I have themed shirts for tons of my lectures. Herzl is not the founder of Zionism, despite what everyone and your uncle have been telling you forever. It's all over the media. It's a brilliant propaganda plot, but it has nothing to do with reality. What he does do is he creates political Zionism. And that's where you see the creation of the World Zionist Organization, the WZO, and within that you have a new type of Zionism where people don't actually have to move, but they can still support the project. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes along with that. We're not going to talk about the waves of migration. It's not the purpose of this video here. But we now have 2 forms of Zionism. Traditional Zionism, which is the religious and or cultural yearning to eventually find redemption and return home. And then Zionism, just straight Zionism, which is a program of secular Jewish nationalism focused on, a return to a home and kind of like creation of new Hebrews and a kind of self-redemption. Much more recently, we see the development of what's called religious Zionism. And this in particular builds up in response to, a lot of Israeli propaganda talking about how they were constantly on the verge of destruction and the Arab states are coming and they're going to wipe us out. And then every single time they just crush everybody. And inevitably, more traditional religious communities are going to see this as a sign that they may be approaching the Messianic Age. So there's people who start moving there, and that feeds into a pretty radical ideology that had already been building up in the Mandate period. We tend to associate this with like the Merkaz Harav seminary in Jerusalem. And this is the idea that Jews are not taking land in Palestine, they are sanctifying it. They're redeeming the land. And through their efforts on the ground, through what they are doing there, they can bring about the Messianic Age. It's sort of like if you begin building a state and trending it toward becoming a halachic state, a state under religious law, and trying to take over more and more of the traditional land there, then you can show to God that you are worthy of redemption. And at that point, he will say, oh, I guess they are worthy of redemption. And then he'll send the Messiah, and boom, everything can happen from there. So it's a way of thinking that you can force God's hand, which is one of the reasons that you have amongst some Haredi communities a kind of reflexive anti-Zionism for a long time that says, hey, this is sort of blasphemous. You're trying to tell God what to do. Although that has been steadily declining a lot, especially in Israel. Tons of the Haredi communities have actually more and more associated with the state and its own nationalism. But that's, again, a topic for another video. Religious Zionism is overwhelmingly associated with the settler movement because these are people, again, taking land. And it's worth remembering that the West Bank is the biblical heartland. This is where most of the major events happened and where the two major states were based. So it's kind of important for them and important for us because anybody holding to this religious Zionist ideology could not concede a single inch of land to a sovereign Palestinian state, because that would be tantamount to telling God, it's okay, we don't want the Messiah after all, and we don't want redemption, which, if you're religious, you can't really do that. So, three major forms of it. Now, there's tons of variations and, subtle differences between anti-Zionist and post-Zionist and whatnot. We can talk about those later, but the key here is to understand that Zionism in the forms that we associate it, the classic Zionism, the secular Zionism, and then the religious Zionism, develop out of European nationalist discourses. The idea that a people defined as such, like a nation, deserves a state to serve their interests, which means that it has an ethno-national component to it. It has an inherently racist component to it that's based on othering binaries. This is our in-group. The state is for the in-group. It is not for anybody else. Therefore, it cannot be a liberal state for all of its citizens. It can only be a state for that group. This is not a problem that you have with traditional Zionism, for example. It's something that's very distinct to the mainstream of secular Zionism and then of religious Zionism. But again, there are some minor schools of thought, variations along the way here, and we can talk about some of those other ways in which Zionism as a concept doesn't have to be as bad as maybe outlined by the Herzls of the world and Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion and Menachem Begin and all these much more radical sort of figures. So hope this helps a little bit, this basic definition of Zionism as an ideology and its three main branches. And again, we can tie its development in the modern period to secular enlightenment and the rise of nationalism and scientific racism. It is a part of that general trend in European and global thought. Cool. All right, that concludes our little ranting series for the evening. Have a good night.